is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Heads of state and government in Africa are convening at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia this week for the 35th ordinary session of the African Union Summit. The meetings will be key to unlocking the way forward for Africa amid wide-ranging challenges, from a resurgence of military takeovers, COVID-19, economic development and climate change. And as the African Union prepares to mark its 20th anniversary later this year, pressure is also mounting on the African Union to do better. Reforms at the organization are yet to be fully effected, and a more assertive role in the continent's peace, security and governance is yet to be seen. 2022's presidency of the African Union switches from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Senegal. But what is the wider outlook for the African Union in 2022? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, peace and security in Africa has remained among the most prominent challenges for the African Union. In strong worded statements from the continental body, the African Union, together with the international community, have condemned recent unconstitutional takeovers of power that have threatened stability in various parts of the continent. But will these statements be enough to change situations on the ground? Daniel Moy brings us the perspective from Addis Ababa on these developments.
The last year has seen the unconstitutional transfer of power in West Africa, with Guinea, Mali and Burkina Faso seeing new leaders rise from their respective militaries. The African Union continental body has come out to condemn the latest attempted coup in Guinea-Bissau.
The resurgence, the recrudescence of unconstitutional change of government, which have dangerously been increasing over the past month, is a sign of great deficiency and deviation, as you have followed the coup in Guinea-Bissau.
We have the resurgence of unconstitutional changes of government that is undermining the foundation of our states and is undermining all our efforts for development.
Besides condemnation, recent coups in Africa have also triggered suspensions and even sanctions from regional and continental bodies as they continue to seek peaceful solutions to the political crisis.
We don't want to see, countries experience any form of instability, and we hope that, the regional economic community, ECOWAS, will deal with that situation, and African Union will, of course, deliberate on this matter as well.
The African Union has reacted with disappointing statements, putting pressure on the coup leaders to respect the constitutional order. For now, what seems problematic for the African Union is the refusal by coup leaders to relinquish power and allow for democratic change. Daniel Arab Moy, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Well, let's now bring on board our panel of experts to give further insights of the African Union at 20 and in 2022. We're now joined by Ambassador Erastus Mwencha, a former Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission. He's joining us from Nairobi. Tolu Akerele is a consultant in counter-terrorism. She's bringing in the perspective of ECOWAS operations and politics of the former French colonies in West Africa. She's joining us from London. Thank you both for being part of the discussion. Tolu, if I may start off with you, because the African Union will be marking its 20th anniversary in 2022, even though the organization itself has been in existence for about 60 years. First, looking back at the African Union over the last 20 years, what stands out for you?
20 years is quite a broad time frame, of course, but I think what's key about the African Union is how it allows regional blocs to deal with regional issues, and it provides more of a continental moral authority with involvement only when it's coming to spillover wars or heavy conflict or anything that will affect the continent at large. So of course we saw the AU's involvement around the coronavirus pandemic. A lot of aid and support came from the AU. We're seeing in Ethiopia, in the current situation now, the AU is involved due to its capacity and ability to draw from the other regional blocs to tackle the issue. So I think really those are some key takeaways, how the AU is an overarching kind of moral umbrella for the continent, but also gives a lot of autonomy and independence to regional areas and allows those blocs such as ECOWAS to kind of put in things like sanctions or handle more local issues on a regional front.
Tolu, you talk about the AU having an overarching moral obligation. Are we really seeing that moral obligation coming to play with the African Union? If you look over the last few years, all the sudden coups that are coming up on the continent.
Thank you for that point. Very, very good point. So yes, of course, in the last 6 months alone, we've seen a resurgence of coups in West Africa, of course, Burkina Faso being the latest. But as I did mention, economic, personal, and regional trade sanctions are much better dealt with by hands-on institutions like ECOWAS because they can apply better pressure through the countries and the localities. So the coup leaders in Mali, for example, were penalized with ECOWAS sanctions, including travel restrictions, freezing of accounts, and border closures that restricted regional trade. But the AU has actually stepped up in the Ethiopian conflict and has appointed Nigeria to lead the efforts. For example, so we've seen former President Obasanjo as the overall civilian and political mediator. And this is because the AU draws from different blocs to take care of continental issues. Of course, this is a very serious kind of conflict which could spill over, and in this case, the ECOWAS region was chosen as we, I say we because I'm Nigerian, are removed from the problem of Ethiopia's regional conflicts.
All right, let me draw in Ambassador Mwenche here. Ambassador, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the challenges and the most pressing issues that the African Union has faced over the last 20 years. And generally, what is your take on where it is today?
Thank you so much. Yes, maybe in putting the context of the African Union, and I want to agree with my fellow panelists for what she has said. African Union at its inception in 1963 recognized that at that time, the most pressing issue was to decolonize and also eliminate apartheid, but left the economic issue to regional economic blocs, which she has ably referred to. And in fact, if you look at what has been done by various regional economic blocs, it's quite some remarkable achievements in terms of facilitating trade, in terms of mobility within the region, and also generally moving towards customs union and free trade areas. But when it comes to continental level, as she has rightly mentioned again, the continent has left itself to face outwards, to dialogue with the rest of the world. And you can see the kind of dialogues now taking place, Africa, China, Africa, Europe, and all that. It's true that in the last few years, there has been a pushback on democratization. There has been quite a lot of democratic, what I call deficits. In fact, the global index on democracy has declined. But this is because the West has also kind of, not because they were seen as so-called guarantors of democracy.
Right.
They have also walked back on it. And so, yes, these coups are coming because a number of countries started to revise their constitutions and go back, not necessarily to one-party state, but more or less to keep the parties in place, but also because of other things. If you look at the coups that are taking place in West Africa, it is because the population is really exhausted from the wars that are taking place there, particularly if you look at the
So let's hear a bit more about these wars, because Tolu, you've been watching this from an ECOWAS standpoint, and as Ambassador Mwenche puts it, there is a pushback on democratization. But of course, we're going to be asking here, how do you rate the African Union's reaction to the developments happening in Mali, in Chad, in Guinea, in Sudan, and now Burkina Faso?
Excellent question. And I, again, would like to thank the ambassador for his amazing insights in terms of the African Union's goals economically and what they've been building over the last 20 years. I think it's very important to remember the French influence in West Africa automatically short circuits any African Union input, because not only will they be dealing with a Western power in France, but also the multilateral institutional backing in the form of the EU. Now, the European Union happens to be an organization that the AU looks to for capacity building and support. So in a sense, is the AU not stuck between a rock and a hard place? Because the trouble is, a lot of Francophone West African natives see this French presence as a continued imperialist imposition, which in turn drives Islamist extremist narratives, but also can be leveraged as a propaganda tool for coups, because the African Union works on end goals. The focus is being a one-stop shop that congregates Africa to remind the continent on the need to act of its own best interests, rather than relying on maybe the West or other forces. While it's great to have that collaboration, I think the coups are a result of a seeming renaissance to the colonial period, which of course so many countries have worked so hard to move past. So I think it's a bit of a push and a pull, and it's not so easy to say the AU isn't doing as much as it should, but there is a delicate nature to these kind of conflicts. And while you want to, of course, support the African countries, it's very difficult when there is a French president that is doing a lot on ground.
Ambassador Mwencha,
even talking on that point, if you could allow, you know, with the onset of the African Union, there is a very strong charter on democracy, governance, and elections. And indeed, many countries have already acceded to this charter, which is a separate charter from the Constitutive Act, which established the EU. And in terms of implementation, if you look at the elections that have taken place in Africa since 1990s, it's not a glass is half empty. The glass is half full. You see quite a number of countries that are now moving towards having genuine, free, and fair elections. But of course, one must also say there have been sham elections in Africa, and that is accepted. But democracy is not an event; it's a process, and so Africa has recognized that and is alive to the fact that this is a process, and that's why there is effort to try and help countries to look at economic issues, because you cannot have democracy without development. They go hand in hand. You need peace, democracy, and development. And when there is one absent, then the others really collapse.
Tolu, do you feel that what is happening under the radar is enough, though, to support the various African countries that are going through turmoil?
I think, again, there's no one-stop fix. If the African Union were to enlist an African Union army and kind of send that army to conflict-ridden countries in Africa, let's say starting with Mali, I think that in turn presents a whole separate set of issues. So I think when you're dealing, especially when we're dealing with insurgencies of an Islamist extremist nature, those campaigns are to win the hearts and minds of your population. So it's to build infrastructure, drive education, lower infant mortality rates, things like that would help. It's not just kind of taking a military or guerrilla warfare approach is it's putting a Band-Aid over a gunshot wound. It wouldn't do much to help the actual inherent problem within that country and or region. So I think it's like I mentioned, and like Ambassador mentioned, the fact that the AU is, and I will keep circling back to this because it is so important, building integration plans as seen in the African Continental Free Trade Area. And you know, the 1991 treaty that we saw signed in Abuja for the African Economic Community, these things are huge steps in the right direction, because there really is a need to get countries and regional blocs working in silos first to a place where they can understand this integration in their own space before moving to a wider context, which is Africa-wide, which of course then is the mandate of the African Union. I think there's only so much that can be done one step at a time. And I think focusing on democracy, good governance, and economic stability,
right,
even towards a place where we have one single currency, things like that, when you have political unrest and insurgencies, of course, that's stabilizing the continent's economy. So things like that, I think, are longer term goals that help in the long run.
Very insightful discussion indeed. Do stay with us because we're going to take a short break now, but do stay tuned. Talk Africa continues in a moment. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Ambassadors Erastus Mwencha is still with me in Nairobi and Tolu Akerele in London are still our panelists today. Let's continue with this discussion. And Ambassador Mwencha, I want to look briefly at some of the other targets that the African Union had put in place. About a decade ago, the target of silencing the guns by 2020, that was 2 years ago. That target has since been pushed forward, going by developments in the Horn of Africa region and, you know, at Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. What's your reaction?
I think let's put that in context, that when in 2013 Africa celebrated the 50th anniversary of its establishment of the OAU, Africa then set in motion to have a relook into what should be the future, and therefore developed what was known as Agenda 2063. Under Agenda 2063, there were a number of frameworks were developed. There were flagship projects, some of which, like the Continental Free Trade Area, Continental Infrastructure Program, Program for Open Skies, the Program for Education, Health, and the rest. And the peace and security is one of them, where then there was agreed that by 2020, 2022, all guns should be silenced. Now, many people have understood the meaning of silencing guns. Silencing guns did not mean there will be no conflict, but that if there are conflict, they should be resolved without having to go into a civil war. And I must say, a lot is being done in this area to move to achieve this target, but also to acknowledge that in a number of countries, the hotspots still remain, and this is quite still a challenge to the African Union.
Tolu, the mechanisms seem to exist. Are they working?
I think, again, it's very difficult to quantify whether something is working or not. There are so many factors that go into play when we talk about whether it's West African, North African, South African, East African insurgencies and conflicts. We can have Islamic extremism in West Africa that is completely different to the Islamic extremism we see in East Africa. So I think in terms of whether it's efficient and effective, I think it's difficult to quantify. I wouldn't say it's not effective. I also think there's always a place for continual improvement. Nobody ever does anything perfectly, nor do they do it perfectly the first time around. So I think the fact that steps are being made and efforts are being made, it's very commendable. And I think the African Union does a very good job within, again, its limitations.
Ambassador Mwencha, in terms of those mechanisms that are in place, can you give us some examples of where they have been effective or efficient?
You're right. If you look at what has happened, for instance, in the case of, Liberia, Sierra Leone, where you had the ECOMOG play a very strong role there. You have also had a similar situation that has been deployed in the case of even South Sudan. You have had interventions that have been there to help, and the process still continues. But also of recent, a number of efforts have been deployed to safeguard, particularly where there is a likelihood of election leading up to violence. And a number of them may not even be visible because this diplomacy is not, as I said, is not mega diplomacy. It is diplomacy that is done by a former head of state going to talk to a sitting head of state. And we don't put that in the newspapers to show that Africa is talking to head of state. This is what they have discussed. So the mechanism does work. But as I think Twala said, we are not here to say, oh, African Union is perfect, everything is working perfect. We all know there are challenges. Some of it is external. For instance, if you look at the economic challenges, Africa has made huge strides in the economic arena, but there are also major problems. And the international community does not help in this. They continue to see Africa as a market that you exploit the raw materials, process them, and then bring back finished material. And you can see how low industrialization is. So Africa has many huge challenges that is looking at. And so it is not, you cannot just concentrate on peace and security, because if your development doesn't work, it's linked to peace. So it is all these things, moving parts, but indeed, and this is not just beating or grandiose effort, congratulations, but to acknowledge there is effort, but yes, there is room for improvement.
And Africa's focus this year, Ambassador Mwencha, very briefly, is the AU theme of 2022, which is touching on building resilience in nutrition and accelerating human capital, social and economic development. Why the focus on this particular theme this year? I mean, amidst the background of everything else that is going on, the peace and security issues, the COVID-19 issues, why this particular focus?
Right. First, the greatest dividend that Africa has is its human resource, the 1.3, 1.4. And if you look at the population of Africa, a lot of our children, particularly under age 5, are malnourished, and there is also a general, indication of undernutrition malnutrition in many communities. And you cannot achieve much in terms of your education, your health indicators, if nutrition is also lacking. In fact, they go hand in hand. And Africa is sitting pretty on very good resources of land, but we also face challenges because of climate change and the rest. But staying on the course of that, nutrition is a major contributor to whether one can achieve good health, but also good education and the rest. And I think this is important. And then it's also linked to agriculture and the rest. So this is a very important goal that is really looking at the human index. At the end of the day, this is really human-centered. And this is a focus to show how Africa is looking at. Development is about human beings. And this is, at the end of the day, it's people, which is the greatest resource Africa has.
All right, I want to get some of your winding up comments. And Tulu, let me start off with you. As the African Union Summit winds down, what are your expectations from this year's summit?
Oh, that's a powerful question. I think for me, I personally don't have any expectations from the summit. I don't, and I don't say that in a negative way. I say that in the sense that, just like Ambassador has mentioned, there are so many different problem areas in Africa. And I think to maybe say one is more important than the other, or one, because it's in our face, more like security and peacekeeping, it should take prevalence over something that's so inherent to Africa, like malnutrition, which we should really have conquered decades ago. So I think for me, the expectation is just to keep having these kind of discussions, to keep having strengthened partnerships on the continent, to keep driving things that we're doing well and acknowledge them, such as fintech. You know, you have great strides in fintech like Paystack or Flutterwave or all these fintechs that are now getting attention from the West, whether it's the US or Europe. I think we need to also appreciate the things that we do very well. And I think we need to pour more resources and backing into that. That would probably be my only personal expectation. But I think what's important is to keep having cross-regional collaboration and keep having these discussions and driving our economies and really helping Africans understand that we can help ourselves and we don't need to keep looking for external guidance, and we have the tools to solve the problems ourselves.
Ambassador Mwencha, Tulu raises an important question, an interesting issue there, that the continent should have eradicated malnutrition, decades ago. But then again, what are your expectations from this year's summit?
This conference is happening against the backdrop of a major pandemic, and which has also shown the rest of the world go regional, disrupting global supply chains, and which has affected Africa. But beyond that, Africa was left hanging in the air because Africa could not even have access to vaccines and the rest. But a few friends of Africa only came to its rescue. And so I think this is a very good opportunity for the summit to look at this issue of research and development, but also vaccine, intellectual property, and dialogue with the rest of the world. But also to send a message to the rest of the world that no one is safe until all of us safe. And I think this is the volley that you saw in the West. But in addition to that, I want to agree with what Tuaru has said, that really the continent is faced with many challenges. And we cannot say one is, supersedes the other. Africa must keep on working at it, but of course also look at those areas where there is pushback, like what you have said in the area of governance and democracy. And I think governance is a major issue where Africa should now ask itself, how are we using our resources? How are we making sure we address the issue of population, issue of inclusiveness? Some of these conflicts that we have, it is because of lack of inclusivity. It's because of lack of development. But where we see infrastructure coming, food is available on the table, the employment is declining, the population is healthy. These are the things that Africa should continue to work on.
Indeed. Thank you so much for being a part of this discussion. And that's all we have time for this week on the program. A big thank you to our guests for their exhaustive insights on this subject. Ambassador Erastus Mwencha, a former Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission, joining us from Nairobi. Tulu Akerele, a consultant in counter-terrorism, joining us from London. Now remember, you can engage us further on this subject through our social media platforms on Twitter and Facebook, and also catch this and more episodes of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. See you again next time. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.